Hello, my name is Chisara, and Kate and I will be talking to you today about red knot conservation. So this is just a quick overview. We're going to introduce the species, talk about its status, some of the threats it's been facing, and what research and conservation has been done. So red knots actually have 6 different subspecies, and they are spread out around the world. It is a medium-sized shorebird that tends to migrate quite a ways between its breeding grounds far up north and its wintering grounds far down south. Um, and you can kind of see the global distribution here. Today we are going to be focused on the rufa subspecies of red knot. So this subspecies winters in the Canadian Arctic, travels down along the southeastern United States coast, and then eventually ends up as far away as the most southern tip of South America for its wintering grounds. So these stopovers on the southeast US coast are very important. This is where the birds build up fat for their journey. They are primarily molluscivores, so they like to walk along the tidal flats. They don't like deep water. They'll only go maybe an inch or so deep, and they use their beaks to prod for mollusks. However, their journey also tends to coincide with the egg-laying season of horseshoe crabs, and that's a very easy source of food for them. They gobble those up. It's very important, and they have that sort of connected relationship with the birds, almost doubling in size with all the fat they put on for that long journey. So this bird is near threatened on the endangered species list, and it is listed as federally endangered in the U.S. So this bird has been on a decline for quite a while. So there's a lot of research going into the diet, the habitat, the feeding strategies all along the route of these birds, trying to figure out why these declines are happening. So in the past, these birds were actually hunted. There was actually quite a bit of hunting of shorebirds, but now in the present, hunting isn't really a big issue with the shorebirds. The 2 biggest threats that we can see to red knots are climate change and human disturbance. So climate change is causing several different issues. For example, researchers are finding that the beak lengths of these birds are starting to shrink, and of course those beaks are what they use to prod for their food in the sand. So they are worried that these birds won't be able to feed as well, and they won't be able to get as fat, and they won't be able to survive the journey as well. Also, they're worried about the timing between the hatching of the birds and their journey down, when the eggs of, say, the horseshoe crabs or the greatest food abundances of their prey might become mismatched. So the birds won't be there when the food peaks. They won't be able to build as much fat, and they won't be as fat as they need to be for their journey. There's also quite a few changes going along on these beaches. There's beach nourishment projects, beach stabilization projects, and these birds, once again, like to feed on very particular shallow tidal flats. So if these beaches get turned into unsuitable feeding habitat, then that will also cause problems for those birds when they need to eat enough food for their journey.
This is Kate Tweedy, and I'll pick up the presentation here. As we've already covered with the biology and the life history of the rufa red knot, this bird will travel between hemispheres just in a single year, and so it's very important for policy and conservation action to work between governments and engage a lot of non-governmental organizations as well in order to be successful in conservation. Some of the countries where red knots occur do have specific laws that protect them and other birds. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act between USA, Canada, and Mexico definitely helps to unify the treatment and approach to migratory bird conservation, including red knots. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also does have a red knot recovery plan that is linked here. And after severe overharvesting of horseshoe crabs over the 20th century, they are now pretty tightly regulated, at least in some states, since the 90s or so. Here are some of the non-governmental organizations that are collaborating across the Western Hemisphere to improve the management of habitat for shorebirds, as well as enhancing connectivity in the management approaches between sites. Check out the link here if you'd like to see more of the specific Wizard shorebird conservation plans. Many of these successful shorebird conservation initiatives have a kind of similar approach. They're doing science to understand the declines and the threats. They're engaging with local communities so that the people who actually live where the red knots are get engaged in decision making. They're also collaborating between many governmental and non-governmental organizations and local government as well in order to pool their resources together. And of course, all these kind of work together to eventually get policy, get legal protections put in place to protect these birds. Now we're going to speak with our red knot expert. So Fletcher Smith is currently a wildlife biologist with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, and he has over 20 years of experience working in the field with bird conservation, and red knots have been a major theme recently in his career. Thanks, Fletcher, for joining us for this interview today, and we can get started just with you telling me a little bit about like how long you've worked with red knots and how you got started.
Yeah, I started working with red knots. It was kind of accidental encounter. I was doing marsh sparrow, breeding marsh sparrow surveys on the barrier islands in Virginia, and happened to be walking down the beach and saw pretty big numbers of knots. And one of the very first birds I saw was flagged orange, which signifies that it was banded in Argentina. And I just thought that that was really cool. A couple years later, my inquisitive nature, I guess, led to putting in proposals to work with red knots along the Virginia barrier islands, and then initiated a fairly large-scale resighting program there.
All right, so what do you think is the greatest challenge when it comes to conserving red knot?
I would say, from my perspective, it's the fact that they're so highly migratory. They're breeding in the high Arctic, and they're wintering as far south as Tierra del Fuego and stopping at many points in between. So, if there's a weak link in stopovers or on the breeding grounds or on the wintering grounds, there's not a whole lot that the other locations can do about that. So I think it's the fact that they span the entire Western Hemisphere makes it such a great challenge to conserve them.
And so kind of leading off of that, what is Georgia DNR doing to conserve red knots, and how does that kind of fit into the hemispheric context of red knot conservation?
Yeah, so Georgia DNR is in a pretty unique situation in regards to other parts of the of stopover locations or wintering or breeding. So we have about 100 miles of coastline and not very much development along that coastline, and that's typically really good for shorebirds. But we do have a lot of recreational boating. We have the few inhabited islands can have really good red knot habitat. So I'd say our biggest challenges locally, at least in Georgia, are recreational boaters, dogs running on beaches. It's that kind of issue from a conservation perspective. I don't know that those are causing mortality events, though. And then long term, if you look at the Georgia coast, we have three species that appear to be the most important for red knots when they're stopping in the southeast. Millennia, which is a bivalve, Donax, which is also a bivalve, and then horseshoe crab eggs. And so, long term, you could see impacts from sea level rise or climate change, as the waters are warming, we may see differences in distribution or mistiming. So the birds arrive in Georgia in spring migration to coincide almost perfectly with the current peak of horseshoe crab spawning in Georgia. And just through time, maybe that there will be a divergence in horseshoe crab spawning and arrival times of red knots. So we don't have the direct mortality threats, but we have threats that could accumulate. If a number of threats are happening in Georgia, you could see them accumulating to be potentially to the lethal level.
All right. And then that kind of leads into the next question. Red knots and horseshoe crabs have such an important relationship, and you're focused kind of on the red knot directly. So how does it affect your conservation work when there's this completely different species that is so heavily tied to the red knots that also has to be conserved for their continuous survival? How does that kind of work with coordination or the sorts of things that you have to do?
Yeah, you can't think of red knots without also thinking through the conservation of the prey species that they depend on. Like for millennia, they are a cyclical bivalve, and I would say that there isn't a bivalve scientist that even understands the cycle that they're on, why they're boom bust. Donax, we may know a little bit more about their distribution and why in some years they have, high numbers and why in some years it's not so great. With horseshoe crabs, at least in Georgia, incredibly understudied. We basically know the important horseshoe crab sites because the birds are there feeding on the eggs. So that was one of our early steps, was to document all the known significant horseshoe crab spawning sites that had red knot use. So those have been delineated at this point, and it's a full mix of public, land, state-owned properties, privately owned, federal owned, and so there's these varying levels of protection of those sites. We have some islands, such as St. Catherine's Island Bar, that have full closure year-round for people, and so this recreational boater problem that we have here, where people go to these critical stopovers, and a dog in a day can just keep the birds off the resource for the entire tide cycle. Horseshoe crabs are nesting, are spawning everywhere. They spawn in marshes, they spawn on shell rakes. So when I'm talking about important red knot habitat, I'm talking about outer coastal beaches that are low energy, and red knots are not going to the marsh spawning sites, they're not going to the shell rake spawning sites. Other shorebirds will, but in direct relation to red knot, I'm talking about outer coastal beaches.
So what can the public do to help red knots?
Yeah, so the real simple things, and this applies to almost all of the birds that we're trying to conserve on the Georgia coast. The simplest thing would be recreate in places that are less important, but also just keeping dog at home. All the birds out there, the nesting birds and the migratory birds, are looking at dog as some type of predator. Maybe they're seeing them as coyote or fox or whatever, but they're trying to fly away. And I've seen lots of dogs out there on the sandbars just chasing birds all day. So, this is a critical time period. These birds are only here for, 10 to, maybe 14 days, the long distance ones anyways. They're arriving at 90 grams weight. They're departing at 180 grams weight. And so they don't have a day or a tide cycle to miss. They can't lose time.
Great. Well, thanks so much again for your perspectives and for kind of filling out the full picture of red knots and what we've been looking into.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yep. Happy to help.
Here is a link to some data that Fletcher shared with us. While we still need more research in order to understand the specific drivers of red knot population declines, we do know that anthropogenic activities and climate change are major threats to red knots and to shorebirds at large. If you'd like to read more about red knots, here are some great resources and our references. Thank you all so much.